The story begins long before that Thanksgiving morning in 1968, when the Bell UH-1 Iroquois first lifted off a Texas test pad in 1956. It wasn't designed to fight. It was designed to help a flying ambulance meant to save lives, not take them. The Army called it the Helicopter Utility, Model 1. The name didn't stick, the sound did. That deep, rhythmic whomp 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 that echoed through the trees. Soon, everyone just called it the Huey. By the time the first Hueys reached Vietnam in 1962, American commanders believed they were witnessing the future of warfare mobility through the sky. No more trench lines or fixed fronts. With helicopters, soldiers could land anywhere, anytime, strike fast, then vanish. That was the theory. Reality was something else entirely. The early Hueys were bare bones. No armor, no heavy guns, no defensive plating. Their main job was ferrying troops, supplies, and wounded men out of danger. They were meant to fly over jungle, not into it. But Vietnam was not a conventional war. It was a war of ambushes and invisible enemies. And every time a helicopter slowed to land, the jungle itself seemed to shoot back. At first, crews improvised. Infantrymen would lean out the open doors, firing M16s and M14s toward the trees. Pilots joked grimly that their door guns were just scared kids with rifles and strong stomachs. But as the missions grew riskier, that joke stopped being funny. Commanders realized they needed something more, someone more. They needed men who would sit in those open doors, machine guns ready, eyes scanning the tree line, firing to keep everyone else alive. It wasn't part of the design. It was a desperate invention, born not from manuals, but from blood. By 1963, the Army standardized the role. Each Huey would carry an M60, the same 7.62mm machine gun used by infantry units, mounted on a swiveling pintle at first, later suspended from bungee cord so the gunner could pivot freely. The M60 transformed the Huey from a transport into a weapon, but it also turned one seat into a death sentence. The M60 weighed nearly 30 pounds without ammunition. Add in the belts, 200 rounds each, fed through from cans bolted to the cabin floor, and the gunner was wrangling almost 200 pounds of weapon and ammo. He had to keep firing as the helicopter descended, laying down suppression for troops below. Every fifth round was a tracer, glowing red streaks marking the path of death through the mist. It was effective. It was terrifying. And it was suicidal. Every door gunner knew the same truth. You can't take cover in a helicopter. You're hanging in an open doorway, 1,500 feet above an enemy who can see you and you can't hide. The wind roars, the metal vibrates, and somewhere below, someone is already aiming back. What no one admitted out loud, not in 1962, not in 63, not ever, was that this position wasn't designed to be survivable. It was designed to be useful. And in war, usefulness always comes before survival. The Huey's evolution from medevac lifeline to airborne assault platform created a paradox. The aircraft saved more lives than any machine before it, yet demanded the lives of the men who flew them. The door gunners were the price paid for progress. By the time the first full-scale combat assaults began, the job was no longer improvised. It was official. The Army gave the role a title, a school, and a slot on the roster, but not a way to survive. These men stepped up anyway, 19, 20, maybe 23 years old, strapping themselves to a doorway between sky and fire. They didn't know it yet, but they had volunteered for the most dangerous seat in Vietnam. The first time a door gunner experiences a hot LZ, something in him changes forever. Imagine this. You're sitting on the edge of an open Huey door, feet dangling, the jungle below turning, from green to dark blur. The pilot's hand raises the signal. You tighten your grip on the M60's handles. The descent begins. The sound becomes a storm engine, rotor, wind, heartbeats all blending into one rolling thunder. At 1,500 feet, you feel exposed. At 300 feet, you realize exposure is the point. Below, the tree line is alive. The air smells of smoke and cordite. And in those few seconds before the helicopter hovers, you are not thinking about courage or duty, only the math. You are flying at barely 15 knots, about 17 miles an hour, moving slowly enough that even a farm boy with an old rifle could draw a bead on you. The helicopter descends at 400 feet per minute. The slower it goes, the easier you are to hit, and that's when you start firing. The M60 roars to life, its barrel vibrating against the bungee cords that suspend it from the ceiling. Every fifth round burns red, carving arcs through the fog. You're not shooting at targets, you're shooting at possibilities. Shadows, muzzle flashes, the suggestion of movement. You fire to suppress, not to kill. Because the moment you stop firing, they aim back. Specialist Robert Zone described that feeling years later. You don't see the enemy, you just feel him. You feel his bullets trying to find you. He wasn't exaggerating. The door gunner's view was spectacular and fatal. Leaning out for better angle meant leaning into the kill zone. The bungee mount that gave freedom of motion also demanded exposure. Every turn of the gun pulled you farther into open air, your body silhouetted against the pale morning sky. You became a moving target, easy to see, hard to miss. And when the enemy fired back, you learned instantly to tell the difference between outgoing and incoming. Outgoing had rhythm, incoming had chaos. One snapped past your ear, a whip crack in the wind. Another punched through the aluminium skin beside your knee. The aircraft shuddered, but the pilot kept steady. Troops jumped. You kept firing. Because if you didn't, those men below would never make it out alive. Veterans later said there was no training for this. The manuals didn't teach how to watch bullets stitch across the sky toward you, or how to keep shooting while your helicopter bled hydraulic fluid. The Army called it air mobility. The door gunners called it a shooting gallery in the sky. By the end of 1963, everyone knew the pattern. The artillery would soften the landing zone, first shells shaking the jungle. Then rocket-bearing gunships would strafe the perimeter. Finally, the troop-carrying Hueys, slicks, they called them, would fly in formation, 8 or 10 at a time. It was a deadly ballet. Precision, noise, and hope. But the Viet Cong learned faster than the manuals could adapt. They waited, let the artillery pass, let the rockets fall. Then, just when the Hueys slowed to land, they opened fire. RPGs left curling trails of white smoke. AK fire snapped like fireworks. The deep, thudding bark of a Dashi heavy machine gun, the dreaded 51 calibers tore through the formation. In theory, preparation made landings safer. In practice, it made them predictable. Every hot LZ became a trap waiting to close, and every descent became a coin toss between survival and statistics. And in that small space, 3 feet of open door, 200 rounds in the belt, a 19-year-old kid held the line between life and death for everyone on board. War is a conversation, a violent one. Every move teaches the enemy how to answer. By 1964, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army had become fluent in the language of the Huey. They had watched the Americans' patterns. They had listened to the sound of the rotors long before the first helicopter appeared over the tree line. And they understood something crucial. The helicopter wasn't just a weapon, it was a promise. If they could break that promise, they could break American morale. So they adapted. At first, enemy fire came from scattered rifles, inaccurate, panicked, easy to suppress. But by mid-war, the jungle itself had teeth. Heavy machine guns were dug into earthen revetments with overlapping fields of fire. RPG-7 teams waited under camouflage nets, timing their shots by sound alone. Entire platoons learned to lead the target, aiming not at the helicopter's nose, but at where it would be when the bullet arrived. They didn't shoot at the soldiers inside. They shot at the machine, the engines, the rotors, the pilot's bubble, and most effectively, at the door gunners. Door gunners became priority targets. The men in the open doors were both the greatest threat and the easiest kill. Hit the gunner, and the entire helicopter's defensive shield vanished. Hit both, and the bird became blind. North Vietnamese units developed an art out of ambush. They knew the approach routes to landing zones, the rhythm of the American assault sequence. When the first artillery barrage hit, they stayed quiet. When the gunships fired their rockets, they held fire. Then, when the slicks descended into hover, they unleashed everything. What followed was chaos and precision. The Dashi heavy machine gun, a Soviet-designed beast firing half-inch rounds, could tear through Huey aluminum like paper. The weapon was so feared that door gunners called it the Red Hammer. A single burst could slice the tail boom in half, shatter control cables, or explode a fuel cell. And those bursts were always aimed right where the tracers came from the open door. RPG 7 seconds made it even worse. The rocket's warhead was meant to pierce tank armor, not thin-skinned aircraft. Against a helicopter, it was overkill. One hit could obliterate a Huey in midair. One near miss could send it spiraling down in flames. Door gunners could see the rocket trails, white smoke lines arcing toward them, but by the time they moved, it was already too late. The Viet Cong called it killing the dragon's eyes. They meant the gunners. Specialist Thomas Peña's crew learned that lesson near the Cambodian border. Chalk 1 had landed clean. Chalk 2, his helicopter, followed until the tree line erupted. AK-47 fire hammered the sides. A rocket streaked across the formation, missing by feet. The gunners on both doors fired back, tracing red arcs across the jungle. Then a single round came up through the floor, through the gunner's helmet, and everything went silent. He was 19 years old, 3 months in country. He died before the helicopter hit the ground. That became the grim pattern. Helicopters went down. Other helicopters came back to rescue them. Those rescuers became targets themselves. The enemy didn't just learn how to shoot, they learned how to bait the Americans. A downed Huey was irresistible. It meant wounded crew, classified radios, weapons, and sometimes survivors still fighting on the ground. It also meant more Hueys would come. Every time one fell, the sky filled with more medevac birds, gunships, troop carriers, each one risking the same fate. It became a cycle of courage and catastrophe. By 1965, intelligence officers were blunt in their assessments. The enemy has learned the pattern. They were right. The jungle now spoke back. And for every helicopter that landed safely, another burned in the valley below, a blackened silhouette against green. The Americans called it bravery. The North Vietnamese called it adaptation. But to the door gunners caught in the middle, it was just another day inside the world's deadliest classroom. Every war creates its own definition of courage. For the door gunners of Vietnam, courage wasn't a moment, it was a daily routine. A door gunner's shift started long before the blades spun. Checking ammo belts, clearing the weapon, making sure the bungee mount moved freely, taping dog tags to their boots in case they didn't come back. It was ritual, mechanical, steady, masking the fear that came with every flight. They didn't talk about fear. They talked about luck. Luck decided who lived and who didn't. Luck decided whether a round went through the floor or through a man. Luck decided whether you returned to base with a story or with an empty seat beside you. Warrant Officer Ron Timberlake understood that better than most. He flew Chalk 6 during an insertion near the Cambodian border, the same mission where Chalk 2 went down. The call came over the radio. Bird 2 is hit. They're down. Then static. The flight leader ordered an abort, but Timberlake looked down and saw them wounded. Americans pinned under fire. He ignored the order. He banked left, dropping his Huey straight into the kill zone. The approach was suiciding a 90-degree angle straight at the enemy's guns. His door gunners opened fire, twin streams of red tracer carving through the jungle. RPGs whooshed past the windshield. 8K fire shredded the side panels. But the helicopter kept descending. 30 seconds on the ground. 10 men pulled aboard. One gunner hit in the arm. The other slumped forward, gone before anyone noticed. Hydraulic fluid poured from the floor like blood. Timberlake lifted off anyway, the bird shaking violently, leaking smoke. They made it back, barely. For that flight, he received the Silver Star. He later said, "I didn't think about medals. I thought about the guys down there, and the men beside me. That was the unspoken code. When one Huey went down, others always came. Because not going meant leaving brothers to die." The soldiers on the ground saw this, saw the open doors, the men firing non-stop, leaning so far out they looked like they'd fall. They watched door gunners keep shooting even as rounds hit the fuselage, even as their helicopters bled smoke and fuel. And in those moments, a bond was forged. Infantrymen revered the door gunners. They didn't see them as aircrew. They saw them as guardians angels with machine guns. In letters home, soldiers often mentioned them by name. "The guy on the left door saved us. He kept shooting until we were clear." That bond went both ways. Door gunners often said the only thing worse than flying into a hot LZ was leaving men behind in one. Still, the cost was unbearable. By late 1965, some units had lost every door gunner they'd trained, every single one gone, wounded, or rotated home. New recruits arrived weekly, learning from veterans who had been in country maybe 3 months. Then those veterans were gone too, and the cycle repeated a conveyor belt of courage feeding into the sky. The memorial services were brief: a rifle, a helmet, a pair of boots. The chaplain reading the 23rd Psalm over rotor noise in the distance. Then the pilots walked back to their birds, and the next flight took off. There was no pause, no reset. The war didn't wait for grief. A young crew chief once wrote in his diary, "We don't fight for country anymore. We fight for whoever's in the other seat." That's what kept them flying. Not orders, not medals, but the faces beside them. Every time a helicopter rose off the pad, they knew the odds. And they went anyway, because the man sitting across from them, the pilot, the crew chief, the soldiers waiting to jump, depended on it. That was the cost. And for the door gunners of Vietnam, it was a price they paid willingly, mission after mission, until either their tour ended or they did. The M60 machine gun, it looked like salvation. But for many door gunners, it was a slow-moving death sentence made of steel. The Army called it the pig. It was heavy, temperamental, and unforgiving, a weapon that demanded strength, patience, and luck. In Vietnam's heat and humidity, it demanded even more. The M60 could spit 700 rounds a minute in theory. In practice, the jungle laughed at those numbers. Moisture swelled metal. Fine red dust from the landing zones worked its way into the action, grinding like sandpaper on every moving part. Within minutes of sustained fire, the barrel glowed orange. If you were lucky, it just smoked. If you weren't, the latch would slip, and the barrel would drop straight out of the gun mid-flight, a 2-foot iron spear tumbling into the jungle below. For a ground soldier, a jam meant cover. For a door gunner, it meant death. When the weapon failed, the gunner had to clear it instantly, lift the feed tray, pull the belt, slap the cover closed, all while hanging halfway out of an open helicopter that was being riddled with bullets. One veteran said, "When your gun jams, you have 3 seconds to fix it, or someone else dies." The M60's design made exposure mandatory. To keep the barrel clear of the fuselage, the gun had to extend outside the door. That meant the gunner's chest and head had to follow. Every time he fired, he leaned into the wind, helmet vibrating, brass casings bouncing off his arms. He'd adjust the belt with one hand, squeeze the trigger with the other, body half outside the aircraft, a perfect target framed against the sky, and behind him, a wall of ammunition. 1,000 rounds of 7.62 millimeters NATO, sometimes more, cans stacked like bricks, belts hanging from hooks above the cabin, swaying with every maneuver. It was enough firepower to hold a landing zone, and enough explosive material to turn the helicopter into a funeral pyre. Tracer rounds were the enemy's cruel ally. A single glowing bullet could pierce the Huey's skin, hit those belts, and ignite the ammunition. The result was instant, a flash, a roar, and then nothing but falling metal. Several Hueys vanished that way, one hit to the ammo cans, and the whole bird disintegrated midair. There was no time to scream, no time to react. The gunner's armor offered little comfort. They called it the chicken plate, a ceramic slab shaped like a rib cage, weighing 22 pounds. It was supposed to stop small arms fire. It didn't. Rounds that missed the plate tore through arms, legs, and faces. A burst of 12.7 millimeters fire from a Dashi heavy machine gun could cut straight through the plate, the man behind it, and the wall of the Huey in one pass. And yet, even with the odds stacked against them, door gunners trusted that weapon. They cleaned it, named it, decorated it. Some carved initials into the stock. Others tied photos of wives or girlfriends to the ammo cans, superstition against bad luck. Because the M60 was both the instrument of their survival and the tool of their destruction. It was the only thing standing between the men inside and the enemy below, and the very reason the enemy aimed higher. Crash investigators later noticed a haunting pattern. Almost every recovered Huey told the same story. Door gunners found slumped forward, hands still on the grips, barrels still hot, belts half spent. They had died mid-trigger pull, doing exactly what they were there to do. One report simply read, Gunner, KIA at station. Weapon expended approximately 600 rounds. There was no poetry in those words, but there was devotion, the kind you can't train, only witness. They died not because their weapon failed them, but because they refused to stop firing even after it did. By 1968, the statistics were impossible to ignore. Too many helicopters were going down. Too many names were being carved into too many plaques. The Army's aviation branch began asking hard questions. Why were door gunners dying faster than infantrymen, the very soldiers they were sent to protect? The answer, everyone knew, but no one wanted to say out loud. Because their job demanded it. The Army tried to fix it anyway. Engineers designed armor kits, ceramic floor plates, side shields, armored fuel cells, reinforced pilot seats. But every pound of protection meant a pound less payload. A fully armored Huey could carry 6 men instead of 8. And in a war where missions were measured by how many we can bring in, the choice was obvious. Protection or capacity. They chose capacity. So, the door gunners kept flying with flak jackets and chicken plates that couldn't stop rifle fire, helmets that couldn't stop heavy rounds, and a courage that couldn't be manufactured. Still, improvement came slowly, painfully, and always after blood was spilled. The UH-1H model arrived with a stronger engine, able to carry more armor. The AH-1 Cobra gunship took the burden of heavy attack, giving the slicks some relief. But even with these advances, the basic equation didn't change. Helicopters still had to slow down, still had to hover, still had to expose themselves and the men in the doors to incoming fire. Major Charles Kelly's death in 1964 proved that the enemy didn't care about symbols. Kelly commanded a medevac unit call sign Dust Off 65. On July 1st, he received a call for an emergency pickup. Troops were pinned down. Kelly's crew begged him not to go. The area was hot, crawling with Viet Cong. He went anyway. His Huey took multiple hits. When ordered to turn back, Kelly's reply came calm and firm over the radio. When I have your wounded. Moments later, a single round struck him in the chest. The helicopter crashed in flames. His words became the motto of every medevac crew that followed, and a quiet anthem for every door gunner who climbed into a Huey afterward. Because their job was the same. Go where others won't, and stay until everyone else is safe. Every lesson that shaped modern helicopter warfare was written in those years and in those deaths. Armored pilot seats? Created after too many were killed by rounds through the chin bubble. Self-sealing fuel cells? After too many Hueys exploded from tracer hits. Quick reaction rescue teams? After too many crashed, birds were ambushed before help arrived. Each innovation had a name behind it, a soldier, a crew chief, a gunner who never made it home. Their loss became policy. And yet, the courage never slowed. Door gunners volunteered even after seeing what happened to the ones before them. Some called it insanity. Others called it loyalty. One veteran said, "You didn't fly because it was safe. You flew because someone needed you to." By late 1968, the numbers were staggering. Over 5,000 helicopters destroyed. 42% of the entire fleet either shot down or damaged beyond repair. The odds of flying a full year without being hit were close to zero. Still, they went. Every mission, every landing, every hot zone. They flew into storms of fire and steel, knowing full well that history would measure their courage in statistics, not names. But for the soldiers on the ground, the door gunners weren't statistics. They were the reason anyone got out alive. Those lessons written in sweat, fear, and blood would one day change everything about how armies fought from the sky. But at the time, they changed nothing for the men. Inside the Huey, they still had to lean out that open door, hands on the M60, faces to the wind, waiting for the jungle to start shooting back. When the guns fell silent and the Hueys stopped flying, the noise didn't leave the men who survived. It followed them home in dreams, in silence, in the hum of a ceiling fan that sounded too much like rotor blades. For the door gunners who made it out of Vietnam, survival was not victory. It was confusion. It was guilt, and it was memory that refused to fade. They returned to a country that didn't understand what they'd done. Pilots were celebrated as heroes. Infantrymen earned medals and recognition. Door gunners, the men who had stared death in the face day after day, who had kept everyone else alive, were left somewhere in between. Not pilots, not ground troops, just names on flight rosters. They carried invisible wounds not just from the missions, but from the math of those missions. In the First Cavalry Division alone, some companies recorded 100% turnover among door gunners every 6 months. That meant that for every man who came home, another had replaced someone who didn't, and every survivor knew exactly who that someone was. They remembered his laugh, his last words over the intercom, the way he tied a photo of his girlfriend to the ammo can. Survivor's guilt hit hard. Because in the Huey, there was no randomness to death, only proximity. One bullet through the door instead of the window. One round through the other man's chest instead of yours. It wasn't bravery that saved you. It was geometry. Veterans' reunions decades later told the rest of the story. Men with gray hair and trembling hands would gather around model Hueys and point to places on the fuselage. "This is where Johnson was hit. This panel here, that's where the round came through." They could still smell the gun oil, still feel the vibration in their bones. For some, it had been 50 years. The memories hadn't dimmed a day. They didn't brag. They bore witness. They spoke about the sound of an M60 rattling itself apart, about the feel of hot brass bouncing off bare skin, about the quiet after a crash when the jungle swallowed the noise. And they spoke about guilt, the kind that no metal could ease. Why him, not me? It was a question that haunted every survivor, whispered in sleepless nights and empty kitchens across America. When the war ended, their legacy nearly vanished under the noise of protest and politics. The Huey became an icon, the sound of its blades immortalized in films and documentaries. But those open doors? Those young men leaning out into the wind with their lives hanging by a bungee cord? They became footnotes. Yet, among the infantry, their legend lived on. Ground troops who had been rescued never forgot them. They remembered the red arcs of tracers covering their retreat. They remembered how the door gunners never stopped firing, not even when hit. They remembered that the reason they were alive was because someone else had stayed in the air just long enough. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. lists 58,320 names. Buried among them are 2,274 aircrew, the majority door gunners and crew chiefs. To the world, they are statistics. To the men who fought beside them, they are the heartbeat of every successful extraction, every medevac that made it back, every soldier who lived to see another dawn. Their story isn't one of victory. When the last Huey lifted off from Saigon in 1975, the war in Vietnam officially ended. But for the door gunners who had lived it, and for the ghosts of those who hadn't, the war never really stopped. History remembers the pilots, the generals, the battles, the politics. But the story of the door gunners, the 19-year-olds who sat in open doorways, machine guns roaring, trading their safety for everyone else's survival, remains largely untold. They didn't survive because the mission wasn't designed for them to. The Huey's open door was both lifeline and target. Every flight into a hot LZ demanded a sacrifice exposure in exchange for effectiveness. And they accepted that exchange every single time. They didn't hesitate. They didn't flinch. They didn't run. They just leaned out into the wind and pulled the trigger. The men who designed the Huey never meant for it to become a symbol of death. They meant for it to save lives, and it did. Thousands of wounded soldiers survived because of those aircraft, because of those crews, because of those gunners who refused to stop firing, even when the odds were impossible. And though the helicopters themselves have long since been retired, their echoes remain in every modern aircraft that took their place. The Black Hawk, the Apache, the Seahawk, all of them owe their survival systems, their armor, their tactics, to the lessons written in the blood of Vietnam door gunners. Self-sealing fuel cells, infrared countermeasures, ballistic armor plating, quick ingress and egress flight tactics, all of it born from the experiences of men who had nothing but a steel gun and an open sky. 50 years later, those lessons have made modern crews safer. But they also remind us of something we shouldn't forget. Courage doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes it looks like exposure, like sitting in an open doorway, wind in your face, tracer fire in the air, and refusing to stop shooting because someone below still needs you to. The reunions today are smaller, the men older, the stories shorter, not because they've forgotten, but because the weight of remembering gets heavier each year. Their voices tremble, but their message doesn't. We weren't heroes. We were just doing our job. But history disagrees. Because theirs was the hardest kind of courage, quiet, consistent, and selfless. The kind that doesn't seek glory, only duty. The kind that understands survival is never guaranteed and does the job anyway. The final truth of the Vietnam door gunner is simple, and it cuts deeper than any statistic. They didn't die because they failed. They died because success required it. Because the mission, the soldiers, the wounded, the lives they protected always came first. And even as time erases their names from living memory, their legacy remains carved into every rotor blade that turns, every pilot who flies low, and every soldier who makes it home alive. They were the men who chose exposure, and for that choice, the world owes them more than remembrance. It owes them gratitude for proving that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing your duty while staring right into it. It's one of endurance. They survived, not because the job was survivable, but because they refused to stop flying. They carried their ghosts home with them, quietly, faithfully, as they had carried everything else. When the last Huey lifted off from Saigon in 1975, the war in Vietnam officially ended. But for the door gunners who had lived it, and for the ghosts of those who hadn't, the war never really stopped. History remembers the pilots, the generals, the battles, the politics. But the story of the door gunners, the 19-year-olds who sat in open doorways, machine guns roaring, trading their safety for everyone else's survival, remains largely untold. They didn't survive because the mission wasn't designed for them to. The Huey's open door was both lifeline and target. Every flight into a hot LZ demanded a sacrifice exposure in exchange for effectiveness. And they accepted that exchange every single time. They didn't hesitate. They didn't flinch. They didn't run. They just leaned out into the wind and pulled the trigger. The men who designed the Huey never meant for it to become a symbol of death. They meant for it to save lives. And it did. Thousands of wounded soldiers survived because of those aircraft, because of those crews, Because of those gunners who refused to stop firing, even when the odds were impossible. And though the helicopters themselves have long since been retired, their echoes remain in every modern aircraft that took their place. The Black Hawk, the Apache, the Seahawk, all of them owe their survival systems, their armor, their tactics to the lessons written in the blood of Vietnam door gunners. Self-sealing fuel cells, infrared countermeasures, ballistic armor plating, quick ingress and egress flight tactics, all of it born from the experiences of men who had nothing but a steel gun and an open sky. 50 years later, those lessons have made modern crews safer. But they also remind us of something we shouldn't forget. Courage doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes it looks like exposure, like sitting in an open doorway, wind in your face, tracer fire in the air, and refusing to stop shooting because someone below still needs you to. The reunions today are smaller, the men older. The story's shorter not because they've forgotten, but because the weight of remembering gets heavier each year. Their voices tremble, but their message doesn't. We weren't heroes. We were just doing our job. But history disagrees. Because theirs was the hardest kind of courage, quiet, consistent, and selfless. The kind that doesn't seek glory, only duty. The kind that understands survival is never guaranteed and does the job anyway. The final truth of the Vietnam door gunner is simple, and it cuts deeper than any statistic. They didn't die because they failed. They died because success required it. Because the mission, the soldiers, the wounded, the lives they protected always came first. And even as time erases their names from living memory, their legacy remains carved into every rotor blade that turns, every pilot who flies low, and every soldier who makes it home alive. They were the men who chose exposure, and for that choice, the world owes them more than remembrance. It owes them gratitude for proving that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing your duty while staring right into it.